The walls of my life were built of ivory and ebony. 88 keys, a disciplined universe of sound I could command, contain, and perfect. For 20 years, this was my fortress. Inside it, I was Theodore Ashton, the maestro, the prodigy who never faltered. My hands did not shake, my heart did not race. My performances were praised for their technical brilliance, their flawless execution. Critics used words like architectural and intellectually rigorous. They never used words like passion or soul, and I took that as a compliment. Soul was messy. Passion was a loss of control. I had built a career, a life, on the foundation of absolute control. Then the foundation cracked. The contract with the Philharmonic, the one that was supposed to cement my legacy, vanished in a puff of boardroom smoke and whispered excuses. A shift in artistic direction, my agent Julian had said, his voice slick with pity I didn't want. They're looking for something more contemporary, more raw. Raw. The word felt like an insult, a piece of grit in a precision-engineered machine. My architecture was no longer in vogue. My fortress was suddenly a museum piece, antiquated and silent. The silence that followed was not the reverent hush of a concert hall. It was a dead, pressurized void. It filled my penthouse apartment, mocked the polished black lacquer of my grand piano, and echoed the hollowness that had taken root in my chest. For a month, I didn't play. The keys felt alien under my fingertips, cold and accusing. My hands, instruments of global acclaim, trembled when I reached for a glass of water. Julian called with the lifeline. A deal, a compromise, a humiliation dressed up in corporate synergy. The label, in a desperate bid to appear nurturing of new talent while sidelining me, had a proposition. A young composer, a wunderkind they were pouring millions into, needed a mentor. He was their future, their raw talent. His name was Leo. I was to take him under my wing, sequester myself with him for 2 months at a remote recording studio in the mountains, and help him finish his debut symphony. In return, the label wouldn't formally terminate my contract. They would just pause it. A stay of execution. He's a genius, Theodore, Julian had insisted. But he's green. He needs your discipline, your structure. What he meant was, they were putting their untamed beast in a cage with a master who had lost his whip. I was to be a glorified babysitter, a finishing school for the very artist who represented my obsolescence. The lie was that I was the master, the teacher. The truth was that I was a ghost, haunting the machine that was moving on without me. I agreed. Of course I agreed. The silence was too loud, and the alternative was admitting that the walls had already fallen. Pride was a luxury I could no longer afford. My armor was control, and this pathetic deal was the only scrap of it I had left. He was waiting for me on the porch of the studio, a sprawling structure of dark wood and glass that clung to the mountainside like a promise of isolation. I saw him before he saw me, a silhouette against the bruised purple of the twilight sky. He was all sharp angles and restless energy, pacing the length of the deck, a phone pressed to his ear. Even from a distance I could see the tension in his shoulders. He wasn't the effortless prodigy I had pictured. He was a tightly coiled spring. When my car crunched to a halt in the gravel driveway, he ended the call abruptly, shoving the phone into his pocket. He turned, and for the first time I saw him clearly. He was younger than I'd expected, maybe 24, with a storm of dark hair that fell into his eyes and a jaw that looked like it was permanently clenched. He wore a ridiculously soft-looking gray sweater, the kind that was an open invitation to touch, and worn jeans. He looked less like a composer and more like a poet who had forgotten to eat for 3 days. He didn't smile. He just watched me get out of the car, his eyes, a startling, intense blue, tracking my every movement. It was the gaze of an analyst or a predator. I felt a sudden, idiotic urge to straighten my perfectly tailored jacket to reinforce the perimeter. "Theodore Ashton," he said. It wasn't a question. His voice was lower than I expected, with a rough edge to it, like gravel under velvet. "Leo," I replied, my tone clipped, professional. The first brick in the new wall. We did not shake hands. The space between us was a charged vacuum, a silence that was already different from the one in my apartment. This one was alive. It hummed with unspoken things. He just nodded, grabbing one of my bags before I could protest. The brief brush of his fingers against mine as he took the handle was like a static shock. I flinched, pulling my hand back as if burned. He didn't seem to notice, or he chose to ignore it. He simply turned and walked inside, leaving me to follow his back, the soft gray wool of his sweater, a strange beacon in the dimming light. The lie had begun. I was the mentor, he was the student, and these were the rules. I followed him into the belly of the beast, the cold, hard shell of my professionalism, the only armor I had left. It felt terrifyingly thin. The studio was a cathedral of soundproofing and glass. The main room was dominated by a Fazioli concert grand, its polished black surface reflecting the stark modern light fixtures like a dark, still lake. Beyond a wall of glass, the mountains stood like ancient, silent judges. It was beautiful and completely sterile. A perfect prison. Leo dropped my bag by the door. "My stuff is in the room on the left. You can take the one on the right. Kitchen's through there. We've got supplies for a month, so no need to go anywhere." No need to go anywhere. The words hung in the air, a casual confirmation of our shared sentence. "The studio is booked from 8 in the morning until 10 at night," I stated, my voice echoing slightly in the cavernous space. "We should maintain a professional schedule. Rule 1. We are colleagues, not roommates." He turned to face me, leaning back against the piano, his arms crossed over his chest. The pose was casual, but the tension in his forearms was visible even through the thick sweater. "Right, a schedule." He looked me up and down, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. It might have been amusement. It might have been contempt. "Whatever you say, maestro." The honorific was a barb, and we both knew it. It was a reminder of what I was and what I was failing to be. I ignored it, moving past him to inspect the piano. My domain, my shield. I ran a hand over the cool, smooth lacquer, the familiar texture a small, grounding comfort. "We'll start tomorrow, 8 a.m. sharp," I said, not looking at him. "I'd like to see everything you have so far." "It's a mess," he said, his voice quiet now. All the earlier defiance seemed to have drained out of him, replaced by a weariness that felt ancient. "That's why I'm here." The words tasted like ash in my mouth. I was here to fix his mess while my own life was a smoldering ruin. The irony was so bitter it almost made me want to laugh. A dry, humorless sound. But I held it in. Control. Always. Control. He didn't reply. He just pushed himself off the piano and disappeared into his room. The click of the door shutting behind him, a definitive, resounding period on our first interaction. I was left alone in the vast, silent room with the piano and the judgmental mountains. The air was thick with the lingering scent of his cologne, something clean and sharp, like cedar and cold air, and the suffocating weight of the next 60 days. I retreated to my own room, a minimalist cube of white walls and gray linens. It was as impersonal as a hotel room, which suited me. I unpacked my suitcase with meticulous precision, arranging my shirts by color, placing my toiletries in a perfect line on the bathroom counter. It was a familiar ritual, a way of imposing order on a chaotic new environment, a way of pretending I was still in command. But the fortress was already breached. The memory of the static shock from his touch lingered on my skin. The sound of his low, gravelly voice was an unfamiliar note in the tightly composed score of my life. And through the wall, I could hear the faint, rhythmic scratching of a pencil on paper, a sound of frantic, desperate creation that was the complete antithesis of my own silent, sterile perfection. It was the sound of everything I had lost, and everything I was supposed to fix. The first week was a study in controlled distance. We orbited each other like two celestial bodies caught in a reluctant gravitational pull, close enough to feel the force, but never touching. Our schedule was my anchor. At 8 a.m., I would enter the main studio to find him already there, hunched over the piano or a sea of sheet music, a half-empty mug of coffee steaming beside him. He always looked like he hadn't slept, with dark circles under his eyes that stood out against his pale skin. I was the consummate professional. I analyzed his compositions, my red pen slashing through bars of music, circling dissonant chords, questioning rhythmic choices. My critiques were precise, technical, and utterly devoid of emotion. I was building a wall of theory and structure between us, a barrier of pure intellect. The transition here is weak, I'd say, my voice flat. The brass is overpowering the strings. You're losing the melodic line. He would just nod, his jaw tight, and stare at the page. He rarely argued. He absorbed my criticisms with a tense, simmering silence that was more unsettling than any outburst would have been. He'd take the notes, retreat to his corner of the room, and the frantic scratching of his pencil would begin again. We ate our meals separately. I'd cook for myself at 1. He'd emerge from his creative haze around 3 and make a sandwich. We never sat at the small kitchen table together. The space was too small, the proximity too dangerous. It was easier to maintain the pretense of our professional roles when we kept to our designated zones. I had the piano. He had the desk littered with his chaotic genius. The kitchen was a no man's land we crossed with careful, deliberate speed. But the silence was a living entity. It was filled with the sound of his breathing, a soft, uneven rhythm that I started to notice when he was deep in thought. It was filled with the rustle of his sweater sleeve against paper, the quiet click of his pen, the soft thud of his mug on the wooden desk. These small sounds became magnified in the acoustically perfect room, weaving themselves into the fabric of my awareness until I could not ignore them. His presence was a constant, low-grade hum of energy at the edge of my perception. It was heat. When he passed behind me as I sat at the piano, I could feel the warmth radiating from his body, a fleeting caress of air that made the hairs on my arms stand up. I would freeze, my fingers hovering over the keys, until the sensation passed. My body's betrayal was infuriating. It was an animal response, primitive and uncontrolled. I was a man of the mind, of discipline. This physical awareness was a foreign language my body was suddenly, alarmingly, fluent in. He smelled of cedarwood and coffee, and something else, something uniquely him. A faint, clean scent, like laundry dried in the mountain air. Sometimes after he'd left the room, the scent would linger, a ghostly imprint of his presence. I found myself taking a deeper breath, just for a moment, before my conscious mind would recoil in disgust at my own weakness. This is proximity, I told myself. A simple consequence of sharing a confined space. It means nothing. It's data, sensory input to be processed and discarded. But I didn't discard it. I cataloged it, hoarded it. The way his brow furrowed in concentration, the way he chewed on the end of his pencil. The rare, fleeting moments when he would play a new phrase on the piano, his body swaying with a raw, uninhibited grace that I, with all my technical perfection, had never possessed. In those moments I would watch him from the corner of my eye, a thief stealing glimpses of a fire I had long ago extinguished in myself. The first accidental touch happened on day 8. He was showing me a new section, a frantic, chaotic cascade of notes that was brilliant and completely unplayable. He leaned over my shoulder, his arm brushing against mine as he pointed to a specific bar on the sheet music spread across the piano. His warmth soaked through the thin fabric of my shirt. It was not a fleeting shock this time. It was a sustained, searing heat. Every nerve ending in my arms screamed to life. I could feel the rough texture of his wool sweater, the solid muscle beneath it. I could smell the coffee on his breath. My own breathing hitched. "This part," he said, his voice a low rumble so close to my ear. "It feels muddy." I couldn't speak. My mind, usually a fortress of logical thought, was a whiteout of sensation. Heat, pressure, scent, the sound of his breathing. I felt the magnetic pull of his body, the insane urge to lean into the warmth, to close the infinitesimal gap between us. It was a gravitational force, threatening to pull my carefully constructed world off its axis. "The arpeggios," I managed to say, my voice strained. "They're too dense. Simplify." My own hands were clenched into fists in my lap. I was fighting a war within my own skin. He didn't move for a second too long. A heartbeat. 2. It felt like an eternity. Then he pulled back, and the sudden cold where his arm had been was a physical ache. "Right. Simplify," he murmured, retreating to his desk. I didn't dare look at him. I stared down at the black and white keys, my supposed kingdom. But they were just meaningless shapes. My focus was shattered. All I could feel was the ghost of his touch, a brand on my arm. I lifted my hands to play, to reclaim my composure through the familiar discipline of a Bach fugue. But they were shaking, subtly, but uncontrollably. I stood up abruptly. "Break," I announced to the empty air, and fled to my room, my heart pounding a frantic, terrified rhythm against my ribs. I pressed my back against the cool, solid wood of the door, a flimsy barrier against the chaos he had unleashed in me. This is untenable. The thought was a cold, sharp spike of panic. This professional distance, this carefully policed border, was a fiction. He had crossed it without even trying, and a part of me, a deep, starved, treacherous part, had wanted him to. I was drowning, and I had just realized I was the one letting the water in. The days that followed were a torment of hyper-awareness. Every near miss, every shared glance, every moment of proximity was a spark on a field of dry tinder. I became an expert in the geography of his body, the cartography of his micro-expressions. I learned that when he was frustrated, a tiny muscle in his jaw would jump. I learned that when an idea was taking hold, he would go utterly still, his blue eyes losing focus, looking at something far beyond the studio walls. I learned the rhythm of his restlessness. He couldn't sit still for long. He would pace the length of the studio, a caged animal, running a hand through his already messy hair. He'd stop at the glass wall, staring out at the impassive mountains, as if demanding an answer from them. In these moments, his confident facade would slip, and I'd see a flash of the raw desperation beneath. It was the same desperation I felt when I looked at the silent piano in my apartment. The kinship was terrifying. It was a crack in my armor, a point of connection I couldn't afford. We were working late one night. A storm had rolled in, trapping us in an even more intimate bubble of shared existence. Rain lashed against the glass walls, and the wind howled a mournful, wild song. The power had flickered twice, casting us into momentary, heart-stopping darkness. Leo was at the piano, trying to work through a delicate, heartbreakingly beautiful melody that had appeared out of nowhere. It was the first piece of his music that felt truly vulnerable. He played it again and again, but he kept stumbling on the same phrase, a complex chord that wasn't quite resolving. "I can't hear it," he finally said, his voice raw with frustration. He slammed his hands down on the keys, producing a discordant, ugly crash that made me flinch. He dropped his head into his hands, his shoulders shaking. My carefully scripted response was to offer a technical solution. Perhaps an inversion, I should have said, or simplify the harmony. But the sound of his ragged breathing cut through my professional programming. I saw not the prodigy, but a young man on the verge of breaking. The protector instinct, an emotion I hadn't felt in years, rose up in me, fierce and undeniable. I moved before I could think. I walked over to the piano and stood behind him. I didn't speak. I just reached around him, my hands hovering over his on the keyboard. He tensed, his whole body going rigid beneath my arms. I could feel the tremors running through him. "Breathe," I said, my voice barely a whisper. It was a command to him and to myself. He took a shaky breath. I could feel the expansion of his chest against my arms. Slowly, I placed my fingers on the keys, my hands covering his. His were cold, shockingly so. Mine were warm. I pressed his fingers down with my own, guiding them through the problematic chord, but altering it slightly, shifting one note, just one, to a minor seventh. The new chord bloomed in the silent room. It was perfect. It was melancholic and hopeful all at once. It was the resolution he had been searching for. We held the chord, letting the sound hang in the air, vibrating between us. His breathing had steadied. The tremors had stopped. My hands were still on top of his, a firm, grounding pressure. The friction of his skin against mine, the shared warmth, the sheer, undeniable reality of the contact. It was overwhelming. This was no accident. This was a choice. He didn't pull away. He slowly turned his head, looking up at me. His face was just inches from mine. The rain streamed down the glass behind him, blurring the outside world into a wash of darkness and water. All that existed was this small, illuminated space. His eyes, wide and searching, locked onto mine, and the world stopped. This was it. The gaze. There was no professional artifice here, no mentor and student. The walls, the rules, the carefully constructed lies, they all dissolved in that single, sustained look. He wasn't looking at Theodore Ashton, the maestro. He was looking at me. And what I saw in his eyes was not admiration or defiance. It was a mirror. I saw the same loneliness, the same fear, the same desperate yearning for something to hold on to in the storm. He saw me. He saw right through the armor to the frightened man cowering inside. My heart was a frantic drum against my ribs. I should pull away. I should retreat, rebuild the walls, pretend this never happened. My mind screamed at me to run, to reestablish the professional line. Control, Theodore, control. But I couldn't move. I was caught in the gravity of his gaze, drowning in the impossible blue of his eyes. The air grew thick, heavy with unspoken questions. You feel this too, don't you? This pull, this insane, terrifying connection. His lips parted slightly. He took a small breath, and I felt it more than I heard it. The moment stretched, thrumming with a tension that was both agonizing and exquisite. It was the held breath before the first note of a symphony, the precipice of a fall. Then, with an almost imperceptible movement, He leaned his head back, just a fraction of an inch, and rested it against my chest. It was an act of pure, unadulterated surrender, and it shattered me. The solid weight of him, the trust it implied, broke through the last of my defenses. The fortress crumbled into dust. My hand, of its own volition, moved from the piano keys to his shoulder, my fingers curling into the soft wool of his sweater, holding on as if he were the only thing keeping me from being swept away by the storm raging both outside and inside of me. We stayed like that for a long time. The only sounds the rain, and the echo of that one perfect chord, and the frantic, synchronized beating of our two hearts. The silence between us had changed again. It was no longer a void or a weapon. It was a sanctuary. The shift was seismic. After that night, the pretense of our old dynamic was impossible to maintain. The roles had reversed, but it was more than that. They had dissolved entirely. I was no longer just the mentor, and he was no longer just the student. We were two people clinging to a shared life raft in a vast, stormy sea. The invisible line between us had been erased. He started leaving a second mug of coffee for me on the piano in the mornings. I started cooking enough for two in the evenings, and he would join me at the small kitchen table. The silence between us now comfortable, companionable. We didn't talk much. We didn't need to. We spoke in the shared language of presence, of quiet understanding. My focus shifted from critiquing his work to protecting his process. I saw the vulnerability he tried so hard to hide behind a mask of arrogant genius. I saw the panic that seized him when the music wouldn't come, the self-loathing that followed. His struggle was no longer an abstract problem to be solved with music theory. It was a palpable pain I felt an overwhelming need to soothe. One afternoon, I found him staring at a blank page of manuscript paper, his breathing shallow, his hands trembling. He was frozen, trapped in the terrifying white space of creative paralysis. The old me would have pointed out the weakness, the lack of discipline. The new me, the one who remembered the weight of his head against my chest, simply pulled up a chair beside him. I didn't say a word. I just sat with him in his terror, a silent, steady presence. After a few minutes, I reached out and gently took the pencil from his rigid fingers. I drew a single, meaningless clef at the beginning of the staff, a starting point, an anchor. He let out a long, shuddering breath and looked at me. His eyes filled with a gratitude so profound it made my throat ache. "I'm scared," he whispered. The words so quiet I barely heard them. It was a confession, a crack in his own facade. "I know," I said. And I did. I knew the fear of the empty page, the terror of the silent instrument. I had been living it for months. The walls were down, but the fear remained. I was terrified of this new, uncharted territory. The intensity of my feelings for him was a fire I had no idea how to control. Every glance, every accidental brush of our hands sent a current of electricity through me. I was constantly, painfully aware of him. The way he moved, the way he smelled, the sound of his voice. My life, once a model of Spartan self-control, was now a riot of sensory overload. I was falling, and I had no idea where the bottom was. My nights were sleepless. I'd lie in my bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of him in the next room. The soft rustle of sheets, a muffled cough. I was fighting a desperate battle against myself, against the overwhelming desire to go to him, to close the final, unbearable distance between our rooms, between our bodies. "This is madness," my rational mind would insist. "He's your student, your charge. This is temporary. This is a product of isolation." But my heart, that long, dormant muscle, knew it was a lie. This was the most real thing I had felt in my entire life. The connection was not a consequence of our confinement. It was a rare, fragile thing that had managed to bloom in the most unlikely of prisons. The push and pull became a frantic internal dance. I would allow a moment of closeness, sharing a bench at the piano, our shoulders pressed together as we worked through a passage. And then, panicked by the intensity of it, I would retreat. I would become cold, distant, hyper-professional for hours, rebuilding the walls stone by painful stone. Leo would watch me, his expression a mixture of confusion and hurt. He wouldn't push. He would just withdraw into himself, and the silence would become tense and heavy again. The pain of causing that look in his eyes was worse than the fear that drove me to do it. The cycle was unsustainable. Something had to break. The breaking point came during the 5th week. We had been working on the symphony's finale, a massive, turbulent piece that was supposed to be a triumphant crescendo. But Leo was blocked, utterly and completely. He'd spent 3 days pacing the studio, his frustration mounting with every passing hour until the air itself felt brittle, ready to snap. That night, I was woken by a sound from the studio. A crash, followed by the splintering of wood. My heart leaped into my throat. I threw on a shirt and ran out of my room. The main studio was dark, except for the cold blue moonlight filtering through the glass walls. Leo was standing in the center of the room, his chest heaving. At his feet lay the shattered remains of the piano bench. Manuscript paper was scattered everywhere, like fallen leaves after a storm. He looked wild, cornered. His eyes found mine in the darkness, and they were filled with a terrifying, hollow despair. "I can't," he choked out, the words ripped from him. "It's not there. There's nothing left. It's all gone." This was it. The complete unraveling. This was the vulnerability he had tried so hard to conceal. He wasn't a genius. He was a boy, terrified that the wellspring of his talent had run dry. He was a fraud, just like me. I walked toward him slowly, carefully, as one would approach a frightened animal. I didn't stop until I was standing directly in front of him. The air between us crackled with his pain. "It's not gone," I said, my voice low and steady. I was anchoring myself as much as him. "You don't understand," he said, shaking his head, a broken, humorless laugh escaping his lips. "They're expecting a masterpiece. The label, my family, everyone. And I have nothing. I'm empty." He looked at me, his gaze pleading. "You're supposed to fix me. That's why you're here. Why can't you fix me?" His words were a knife in my gut. The lie, our foundational lie, stood between us, ugly and exposed. I couldn't keep hiding behind it. Not anymore. He deserved the truth. We both did. "I can't fix you, Leo," I said, my voice cracking. "Because I'm broken too." The confession hung in the air, raw and irrevocable. His eyes widened, searching my face in the dim light. "What are you talking about? You're Theodore Ashton." I was, I corrected him, the taste of failure bitter on my tongue. The Philharmonic dropped me. My contract is worthless. This mentorship? It's not a prestigious gig. It's a pity assignment. It's the only thing keeping the label from announcing to the world that I'm finished. I had said it. The truth I had been running from for months. And in the face of his raw despair, it no longer felt like a source of shame. It was just a fact. A piece of common ground. We were two frauds, propping each other up in a glass house. Leo stared at me, his frantic energy slowly draining away. replaced by a profound stillness. He was seeing me for the first time, not as the icon or the mentor, but as a man just as lost and terrified as he was. The silence that fell was the most profound yet. It was a silence of shared truth, of stripped-down, painful honesty. He took a hesitant step closer, and then another. He stopped when his chest was almost touching mine. He was so close I could feel the heat of his body, smell the scent of his skin. He lifted a hand, his fingers trembling, and gently touched my arm, right over the spot where his arm had brushed mine weeks ago. "You're not finished," he whispered, his voice thick with an emotion I couldn't name. It was fierce and protective, and that's when I broke. A sound, a choked sob I hadn't even known was there, escaped my lips. The control I had clung to for my entire adult life disintegrated into nothing. The weight of my failure, my loneliness, my terrifying, impossible hope for this man in front of me, it all came crashing down. I fell. I didn't realize I was collapsing until his arms were around me, holding me up. He caught me, his grip strong and sure, pulling me against him. I buried my face in the crook of his neck, my hands clutching the back of his shirt like a drowning man. The soft fabric of his t-shirt was damp against my cheek. I was shaking, consumed by a storm of emotion I had repressed for decades. He just held me. He didn't speak. He just held me, his arms a fortress around me, his hands stroking the back of my head in a slow, soothing rhythm. I could feel his heart beating, a steady, solid rhythm against my chest, a lifeline in the chaos. The scent of him, cedar and clean air, and something intrinsically Leo, filled my senses, a grounding, calming anchor. This was the reversal I never saw coming. I was supposed to be his pillar of strength, his structured guide. But in my moment of complete collapse, he became mine. He held my broken pieces together. After an eternity, my shudders subsided. My breathing slowed, syncing with his. I didn't pull away. I couldn't. To move away from him now felt like choosing to freeze in the cold. I was exhausted, hollowed out, but for the first time in as long as I could remember, I wasn't alone in the silence. I loosened my death grip on his shirt, but didn't let go completely. I tilted my head back, looking up at him. His face was a landscape of shadows and moonlight, his expression one of intense, heart-stopping tenderness. The final threshold was before us. The air was thin, the precipice steep. The old rules were burned to ash. All that was left was this raw, terrifying, beautiful truth between us. "Stay," he whispered. It wasn't a question. It was a plea, a command, a prayer. "Don't go back to your room. Stay with me." My mind, that frantic, panicked voice of reason, was silent for the first time. It had no arguments left, no defenses to mount. All that remained was the simple, undeniable need that echoed his. This was the conscious choice, the final surrender. I could retreat to the cold safety of my room and spend the rest of my life rebuilding my fortress of solitude. Or I could stay here, in the ruins, and for once, choose connection over self-preservation. Choose vulnerability over control. Choose him. It wasn't a choice at all. "Okay," I breathed. The word was a release, an unlocking. He led me by the hand, his grip warm and firm, away from the wreckage of the piano bench and the scattered ghosts of his symphony. He didn't lead me to his room. He led me to mine. My room, the sterile, impersonal cube, felt different with him in it. It felt like a home. He sat on the edge of my bed, pulling me down to sit beside him. We didn't speak. The time for words was over. He looked at me, his blue eyes searching mine, asking a final, silent question. I answered by leaning in and resting my forehead against his. The contact was electric, a jolt of pure connection that went straight to my core. I closed my eyes, breathing in the air he exhaled. It felt like coming home to a place I had never known existed. His hands came up to cup my face, his thumbs stroking my temples with an impossible gentleness. My own hands found his waist, my fingers gripping the soft fabric of his shirt, pulling him closer until there was no space left between us at all. This was not about passion in the way the world understood it. It was not about lust. It was about need. A desperate, primal need to be seen, to be held, to be anchored. It was two collapsing universes finding a new center of gravity in each other. It was a drowning man finding air. He tilted his head, and his lips met mine. The kiss was not frantic or demanding. It was a discovery. It was soft and slow and searching. It tasted of salt and coffee, and a relief so profound it felt like a physical release of pain. It was a quiet confirmation of everything that had passed between us in the silences, in the glances, in the accidental touches. It was the breaking of the final silence. I kissed him back with all the yearning I had kept locked away for a lifetime. I poured all my fear, all my loneliness, all my fragile, terrifying hope into that single point of contact. It was a confession more honest than any words could ever be. When we finally broke apart, we were both breathless. He kept his forehead pressed against mine, his eyes closed. I could feel the faint tremor in his hands, still holding my face. "Theodore," he whispered, my name a reverent sound on his lips. I didn't answer. I just brought my hand up to cover his, pressing his palm more firmly against my cheek. I was anchoring him now, just as he had anchored me. He guided me back until my head was resting on the pillows, and he lay down beside me, on top of the covers, our bodies aligned. He didn't let go of my hand. He threaded his fingers through mine, our palms pressing together. He shifted closer, tucking his head into the space between my shoulder and my neck, his arm draped over my chest. The weight of him was the most reassuring feeling I had ever known. It was solid, real, a bulwark against the ghosts of my failure and the fear of the future. I wrapped my free arm around him, holding him close. I could feel the steady rhythm of his breathing against my neck, the beat of his heart against my ribs. The storm outside had passed. The moon cast long, peaceful shadows across the room. The silence returned, but it was a new kind of silence. It was not empty. It was full. It was a shared space, a quiet promise. It was the sound of two broken things fitting together, creating something whole. I fell asleep like that, holding him, being held by him. And for the first time in a very long time, I did not dream of silent concert halls or falling from a great height. I dreamed of nothing at all. I just slept, deeply and without fear, anchored by the weight of the man beside me. I woke to the pale gray light of dawn. For a disoriented moment, I didn't know where I was. My body felt heavy, warm, and strangely at peace. Then I felt the weight across my chest, the soft breathing against my neck, and it all came rushing back. Leo. He was still asleep, his face peaceful in a way I had never seen it. The perpetual tension in his jaw was gone, his lips slightly parted. His dark hair was a mess against my pillow. My hand was still entwined with his, our fingers loosely clasped. The sight of it, so simple and yet so profound, made my chest ache with a feeling that was sharp and sweet and utterly new. Carefully, so as not to wake him, I shifted my head to look at him better. I studied the curve of his eyelashes against his cheek, the faint scar above his eyebrow I'd never noticed before. In sleep, his armor was gone. He was just a young man, full of talent and terror, who had found a safe harbor in the middle of his own storm. And somehow, he had become mine, too. The lie we had started with, mentor and student, master and apprentice, seemed like a story about two other people. The truth was here, in the quiet warmth of this bed, in the easy way our bodies fit together. The truth was that we had saved each other. He had shattered my isolation, and I had weathered his collapse. He stirred, his breathing changing. His eyes fluttered open, blinking slowly in the new light. They found mine, and for a moment I saw a flicker of panic, of disorientation. Then recognition dawned, and his expression softened into something impossibly gentle. He didn't move away. He just looked at me, his gaze clear and steady. There were no questions, no awkwardness. The new silence held. It was a comfortable, known space now. It was ours. A small smile touched the corner of his lips. "Morning," he murmured, his voice thick with sleep. "Morning," I replied, my own voice a little rough. He squeezed my hand. It was a simple gesture, but it held a world of meaning. It said, "This is real. What happened last night was real. We are real." We lay there for a long time, just watching the sun climb higher, painting the mountains outside the window in shades of pink and gold. There was no need to talk about what came next. The future, with its labels and contracts and symphonies, felt distant and unimportant. The only thing that mattered was this present moment, this shared stillness. Eventually, the smell of coffee drifted from somewhere outside our bubble. Leo lifted his head. "I think the machine is set on a timer." "I think you're right," I said. He pushed himself up on one elbow, his expression turning serious. "Theodore, about the music." I put a finger to his lips, stopping him. "Later, not now." He nodded, understanding. The music wasn't the most important thing in the room anymore. We got up and moved to the kitchen, the space that had once been a carefully navigated no man's land. Now we moved around each other with an easy, unconscious grace, our shoulders brushing as we reached for mugs. He poured the coffee while I found the milk. It was domestic, simple, and it felt more profound than any standing ovation I had ever received. We took our mugs and went to the main studio. The shattered piano bench still lay on the floor, a relic from the night before. The scattered sheets of music were a testament to the storm we had passed through. Leo looked at the mess, then looked at me. He walked over to the Fazioli, sat down on the floor in front of it, and began to play. He didn't use a bench. He just sat cross-legged and let his fingers find the keys. A melody emerged. It was not the frantic, chaotic music he had been fighting with. It was quiet, simple. It was the chord we had found together, the one that was both melancholic and hopeful. And it unfolded from there, growing into a theme of breathtaking, heartbreaking beauty. It was the sound of the dawn after a long night. It was the sound of a silence that was finally, truly broken. I didn't say a word. I just leaned against the doorframe, sipping my coffee, and listened. I watched his hands, which were no longer tense or trembling, but moved with a newfound certainty, a quiet grace. He wasn't fighting the music anymore. He was letting it flow through him. He was playing our story. The tension, the fear, the collapse, and then this quiet, hopeful resolution. He glanced up at me as he played, a question in his eye. I gave him a small, slow nod. I hear it. I understand. An unspoken pact was forged in that moment. We would figure this out. The music, the labels, our lives. We would face it together. The isolation was over. The fortress I had built around myself for 20 years hadn't been breached. It had been dismantled, brick by a quiet young man with stormy eyes and a soul that recognized its counterpart in mine. I had come here believing my purpose was to impose structure, to teach control. But the greatest lesson was the one he taught me, that true strength isn't found in impenetrable walls or flawless precision. It's found in the terrifying, courageous act of letting someone in. It's found in the surrender. It's found in the silence after the storm, when you realize you are, for the first time, no longer alone.